Hey everyone, today we are bringing you 12 decks that we think are the best to get started with now that Legends of Runeterra has finally released and we can all actually jump into the game. We've got 6 meta decks that are going to be really good for climbing the ladder, 6 budget decks with the help of our lore expert Swim, who I'm sure you've seen already, but if not, then definitely check out his stream, site and YouTube, which will be linked down below. Remember to also download our deck tracker overlay to take your game to the next level. It tracks all of your cards played and even the probabilities of drawing the remaining ones in your deck. You might have already seen this being used by your favorite streamers. First up, our 6 meta decks, what will likely be crushing games on the ladder. Introducing first of all DAWNSPIDERS, one of Swim's signature mid-range decks and one of the strongest for ranked. With this in Legends of Runeterra, you can actually intentionally feed and it not be a bad thing. The deck revolves around killing off your own units so that you can buff others that are going to be played afterward. So it mostly works around Elise, who will spawn 1/1 spiders when she attacks, and then Dawn Speakers, who grant other allies +1/+1 if an ally has died that round. You have an absolute ton of units who can either kill allies or sacrifice themselves and trigger these effects throughout the deck, and that is the way you're going to make it work. Rasa is going to be one of your big late game threats, clearing 2 of the weakest enemies as long as 1 ally has died this round. Now next up we have Swim's Great White Sharks, which is one of the more snowball aggressive decks that we have. So as you expect, it's a bit more all or nothing than the other decks we're going to talk about, but if you get a good start, you're going to fly off. There are a lot of combos that you're looking for, but the biggest ones are going to be around Lucian and then around Remembrance. You do have a ton of cheap cards that you can throw out early and that you can trade with or chip away with, but the big part comes from having enough allies die to play Remembrance at the end of a turn, which costs 1 less for an ally that died this round and summons a random 5 cost follower from Demacia. That also plays into Lucian, who is going to level up after he sees 4 allies die, which can give you a huge lead, and once you've got Hecarim on the board as well, that will kind of be your finisher. This deck is aggressive, but it surprisingly has a lot of lasting power. That's not going to be normal for an aggro deck and for the other ones in this video. It's a lot because of the card draw letting you continuously pump out threats throughout the game. Discard Aggro is another high risk, high reward deck, but this is incredibly fast, very different, and is all about burning through your cards and opponents before they can get online. That is literally all there is to this deck, but a lot of the skill comes from when to use what and not just doing it blindly. So your win conditions are mostly from your champions. Draven can generate spinning axes when he strikes, which will provide constant damage. Jinx when leveled will let you draw 1 at the start of every turn, and when you empty your hand, you create a super mega death rocket, which is a 2 cost, 4 damage to the enemy nexus, and 1 to all other enemies. The idea is that you burn through your hand in your deck, you level up your Jinx, and then you throw out rocket after rocket, only taking a few turns before the enemy nexus explodes. The mulligan is pretty important for this deck because there's a lot of combo base in it, so you need to know which ones to keep so you can get those combos off each other effectively, which you'll pick up after a couple of games. Also, knowing when to dump your hand to Augmented Experimenter instead of trying to get the maximum value is pretty important, or just when to discard cards that don't get any value in general. There's quite a lot of tough choices that you're going to have to make when you pilot this deck properly, so actually it's not as face roll as it might seem. Next up is one of my favorites, so the FIORA barrier deck. This also doubles as one of our few one-turn kill decks. FIORA and Shen bring some of the best combos you can probably pull off in the entire of the game, and especially some of the most frustrating to play against. There are 2 win conditions in this deck. The first obvious one is going to be the FIORA. When you've got FIORA to kill 2 enemies, she's going to level up, then it's really on for the rest of the game. Once you've killed 4 enemies, you win the game without touching the enemy nexus at all. Greenglade Caretaker is the other side here. When an ally gets barrier, you give that card +2 attack. This can easily grow to a +15 attack unit and outright kill the opponent, but you normally need a good start for that to work. At least by the mid-game point, you're going to know whether you'll be able to grow one of the Caretakers to an absurd level, or if you have to rely on FIORA. Shen is insane for both of these as well, giving a supported ally barrier, but there are a ton of barriers and buffs in this deck. Stand United is the easiest way to make sure that your Caretaker can get through for an OTK by swapping him for something else as well. Now, one of the hardest decks in this video is a VLAD and a Braum mid-range deck using cards from Noxus and Freljord. This is a combo deck that depends a lot on what the opposing player is going to do and then reacting accordingly. Your win conditions are usually playing around a big buffed up Braum or just trying to burst your opponent down very quickly. Most of the time, you're going to be taking the pain early game and kind of waiting for a chance to buff up your units and get a huge trade-off. Aside from your champions, you have a few extra tricks up your sleeve too, like Crimson Disciple can be buffed so when it survives damage, it deals 2 damage to the enemy nexus. Scarmother is one of your big threats. Every time you survive damage, you get 3 attack. Plus with Overwhelm, you can end up blasting through blocks. So we did have some balance adjustments come through before lore was released properly, and that destroyed one of the better control decks that people were playing before, but now we have this ultimate control deck to replace it, and it's actually a very affordable deck to try out. That's partly because it has 0 champions, which might seem very weird, but one of the biggest misconceptions about this game is that champions are stronger than every normal card or follower by default. Like any control deck, you're going to be forcing games to go longer, slowly chip away, and basically survive until much later into the game. You have a lot of cheap cards and removal at your disposal designed to remove any early game threats. You also got a good amount of AoE damage in this deck, which can help create big swing turns and waste a lot of the opponent cards. Rasa made an appearance earlier and is going to be back here again, being an amazing card for removing the enemy board and getting a huge body out there at the same time. Now remember, this card simply removes the 2 weakest enemies no matter how strong they are, and late game your opponent isn't likely to have a ton of low cost cards out there, so you can get some insane value. If all else fails, you have Commander Ledros, probably not saying that right, which will literally cut the enemy Nexus health in half, so that's a decent backup. Let's move on to our budget decks, and if you're just starting out and you don't necessarily want to drop cash straight away to play the decks that we just talked about, then these are the best ones you can make as you boot up for the first time and are really good to get to grips with lore in general. First up, we have our elite. So Demacia has some of the best unit or follower cards in the game, which will also happen to be one of the most straightforward ways to play the game. It plays around sticking out lots of smaller units and then buffing those up with cards like Vanguard Bannerman, which will give everything +1/+1 if the top card of your deck is Demacian, which with 36 cards out of 40, you've got a pretty good chance to hit. It also plays around the mechanic elite, which a lot of your cards are going to be, but things like Battlesmith, for example, have special interactions, so buffing them by +1/+1 when you summon any elite. To avoid it being completely one-dimensional, even though it pretty much is just about your units, it does have this inspiring Mentor Z combo. It gives you 2 quick attacking 4/3s on turn 3, something that pretty much no other deck can manage, and it lets you get board control to sweep through with Demacia afterwards. There are some combos, some thought behind this playstyle as well, but it plays more around units and spells. We have already touched on a discard aggro deck in the best decks one, but we have another here. So if you can't afford the deck with Draven, then this is a pretty good alternative with a few tweaks. You'll mostly be hitting face here using cards like Legion Rearguard, who can't block, but for a 3/2 for 1 cost is pretty insane. Some Dredger is where our discard part comes in a bit more, discarding 1 from our hand to play, but a 4/3 for 2 mana can be overwhelming to start the game. You'll notice that most of these cards are about face damage and board state early, really, and then we have our Jinx and Darius to deal the finishing blow. You do have some direct damage in this deck with Mystic Shot or Jinx's Super Mega Death Rocket, so the idea is to bring the pain early and go for the throat before they stabilize. Now, control decks in every card game can be really expensive to make, but we can combine Shadow Isles and Freljord to put together a decent starter version. This deck relies more on slowing the game down, removing threats and grinding your opponent down with value trades rather than doing any fancy combo to finish them off. There are 17 spells in this deck with 19 followers, and most of those spells are removal. Single target cards like Black Spear will also be able to take down more annoying threats, but you have Avalanche sitting there ready as a big AoE swing turn. We've also got some healing in here from Withering Whale and Grasp of the Undying, so even if you take a little beating to start with, you can recover pretty nicely. Escaped Abominations, which come from your Cursed Keepers, will keep your mid-game going until you finally get to your release or Tryndamere and you're able to finally hit away at the enemy Nexus. Spider decks are really good at the moment. We've already touched on one sort of, but this next one might not be good if you have a fear of spiders at all, but at least isn't just used in control decks. When we swap out our Freljord cards for Noxus instead, we get a very different, much more aggressive style deck. Elise is an extremely good champion once she's leveled up, which needs you to have 3 other spiders on the board. Now normally that can be a little bit tricky sometimes, but not when we have so many spider cards in our deck or things like Crawling Sensation that summons 2 spiderlings if any ally has died this turn. We are fighting more for board control with this deck. Once we have our good start, like we don't really want to give up control, using things like Frenzied Skitterer or Arachnoid Host to buff out other spiders. If that doesn't work, you can fall back on a few bigger cards like Darius or Captain Pharaon, who will swap out your hand for Decimates and deal 4 damage to the enemy Nexus. You can also start without spiders if you want, because we do have Curse Keepers in here that we can kill with our Ravenous Butchers, spawning the Escaped Abomination and having a huge start. Even though we've touched on discard aggro quite a lot in this video already, it is not the only way to play aggressive in Legends of Runeterra. So now we have our Jinx and our Zed aggro deck. This deck is built more around quick attacks and elusive units. Elusive can win games by itself if your opponent doesn't have a good answer in their deck. If you aren't sure, it means that any unit can only be blocked by another elusive unit. Elusive units by themselves are not generally that powerful, so like our Green Glade Duo is a 2-cost 2/1 that gets +1 when you summon an ally this round, but that is why we have a ton of buffs in here to make them way more difficult to deal with and way more threatening. Again, we can use the Inspiring Mentor and Z combo, buffing them up to have 2 quick attacking 4/3 units on turn 3. That will pave the way for more elusive units, but this is mostly a deck fighting for board state and face roll over your opponent. It doesn't have much removal directly, but we still have some really cool combos in here, being able to recall units and buff others. Finally then, we have our mid-range budget deck that combines Demacia and Freljord together. So Freljord isn't just about control, it actually has some insanely powerful units on its own. Saying that, most of your win conditions are still from your bigger cards like Tryndamere, Garen, or Alpha Wildclaw. Garen's actually Demacia, but it's still going to be a win condition in your deck. Getting there will be from a combination of strong early units, buff, and also Challenger as well, which can make you get some really favorable trades and not lose control. This deck does make better use of spells as well, like single combat for example, but they are more there to protect or buff rather than anything else. We hope you enjoy these decks and you get some use out of them. They can get you started as you venture into Legends of Runeterra for the first time. Let us know any of your decks that you're enjoying at the moment, and remember to download our deck tracker to take your game to another level.